It's your host, Skeptical Scott. Welcome to Funny You Say That, a heathens podcast, into religion and back again. Different format today. So far, you've heard several mile markers on my journey into religion during my elementary and secondary years in public schools. But before we get to college, there is that final day of high school. Graduation. Today we have one of our graduation speakers from that night. I remember this night clearly as I was up on stage singing with our choir to commemorate the occasion. It was held at a very formal setting, very classy, the place to be downtown in our city if you ever want to see a symphony, for example. I will let our guest fill in the rest. Today, Matt travels a lot for work as a cross-country trucker, but that was not in his original plan. Matt will let us know about some of those mile markers he has passed, and one of those was stepping away from his role as a pastor with the support of an organization called the Clergy Project, our main topic today. Welcome to the show, Mr. Matt McKellar! Hello, Matt. Hey, who's Dennis?
Who's Dennis?
Who is Dennis?
Dennis is my newest passenger on my truck. I'm a semi-truck driver. I pull a tanker. My girlfriend does these great crochet figures, and so my request for my birthday was a crocheted alien, one of the gray aliens. And so Dennis is now, I've named him Dennis because I have a jackalope named Dakota and another little jackalope figure called Douglas. So it's Douglas, Dakota, and Dennis.
Come on,
Dennis
man.
Happens to be an alien.
Well, and now you know you've been at this a couple years because you're like adding stuff now. So this is pretty cool.
Yeah.
Well, hey, so I was joking a little bit about that night at graduation singing. I doubt you remember, but do you know what our senior song was? It was ridiculous.
I have no idea.
I can show you the world.
Oh, wow. Isn't
From Aladdin.
Like Aladdin, right.
Come on, a whole new world. A whole new, don't you dare close your eyes. Oh man, that's just terrible that was our senior song in my opinion, but
I didn't vote for that.
Well, it was voted on, so our choir sang it as one of the songs, but at any rate, let's let our listeners in on that moment at graduation night. What do you remember?
Well, all the usual things people do with graduation, tripping over your gown and being excited and your friends and all that. But what I think you're alluding to is I happened to be the valedictorian in our class, so I had the opportunity to give a little speech.
Did you have to run your speech by anybody, or did they just kind of trust you to say your piece?
I did not have to run it by anybody. Nobody vetted it, either verbally or the text. Yep, just get up there and talk for, I don't know how long I talked.
And so you did. And who knows what you said. I mean, we're talking a long time ago right now, almost 3 decades, let's put it that way, right?
Right.
Do you remember anything about that speech?
Well, yes, I do. I think I talked about some of the usual things you're supposed to talk about as valedictorian, about knowledge and achievement and optimism and hope and all that kind of stuff.
Too bad ChatGPT didn't exist. You could have just said, I need a graduation speech about optimism. And it makes me wonder if people do that today. But anyway, keep going.
Probably.
Keep going.
But I also, given where I was in my religious journey, I felt that I had an opportunity to verbalize my faith and maybe catch some ears. So I talked about living in relationship to the author of knowledge and about your relationship with God. And I do remember using Shel Silverstein's poem, The Giving Tree, as an analogy or a metaphor for the sacrifice of Jesus Christ. Here I have this captive audience that's got to listen to me for 10 minutes or whatever.
Hundreds of people are forced to listen to you right now. And, I'll tell you, my ears were up, and I do remember kind of glancing at some of the adults that were nearby. And you could just tell they had this, at least a couple of them, I won't say all of them, but a couple of them had this look on their face of, oh, shoot, where's he going? You know what I mean?
Yep, we're going there. Yeah. I must have talked it over with my youth pastor because I remember he was there as well. And in part because he knew some of what I was going to talk about. He was a mentor to me and a key figure in my childhood. So I remember him being there as well as my family, of course.
I don't think it's uncommon to sometimes hear that, you know what I mean? At a speech of, hey, I'm grateful. But it came off pretty strong, I thought. Now let's rewind a little bit. What would you say your relationship with the religion was in the first 18 years of your life?
As a young child, I didn't have much of a relationship with religion. We didn't go to church, that kind of thing. But somewhere, basically, when we moved back to Michigan, because I was born in Flint, and then like elementary school was down in Cincinnati, Ohio. And then starting in sixth grade is when we moved to West Michigan. And that's when you and I were in the same school district. At that point, we started going to church for whatever reason. So that was really my first exposure to Christianity, to the gospel, to all this kind of stuff. And I remember hearing it, and we went to a non-denominational church at first, and then a Baptist church. And I remember hearing the gospel message, and I was like, well, I don't want to go to hell. That doesn't sound like a good thing.
No.
But I also want to live my life and have my fun. This is like seventh grade me reasoning things through, I want to have my fun. So what I'll do is I'll live my life. And then when I'm old, I will become a Christian so that I don't go to hell. And that was my brilliant plan for like a day. And then I had the thought, wait, what if I get hit by a bus today? Then I'm in trouble. And so that was the true origin of my beginnings with Christianity, my conversion, so to speak, done for the noblest of reasons, of course.
Yeah, fear is a big motivator, isn't it?
It is. And honestly, that is what motivated me to be so bold in my valedictorian speech, because sneak preview here, but I ended up going to Moody Bible Institute for college, and the founder of that Bible college, Dwight Moody, this was in the 1880s, he had an opportunity to speak to a crowd, and he made the call to Jesus, but not quite. He kind of said, take some time to think about it. And then like that weekend, the Chicago fire happened.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
A bunch of people died. And so Dwight Moody took away this lesson of like, never hesitate now is the moment to ask people to repent and come to Jesus. So that type of thinking and that story was in my mind. And here I am with an opportunity to speak publicly. You have to take advantage of the urgent moment, because you may not get another opportunity.
Matt, that I don't mean to be morbid, okay, but you know how they say when you get nervous, imagine people naked, right? Right. Whatever that's supposed to do, right? But man, I picture you up there going, all right, imagine everybody, if you don't say this, they're on fire.
Right. That's a lot of pressure for a 17-year-old, right?
It's those things that I don't think people always understand. And maybe they do, but when I think of religion is like, you know how you hear the lukewarm thing. You can't be lukewarm. You got to be all in, or you're not, you're not,
right.
And so if we are to take those words seriously, or we take those, take Moody's message seriously, somebody could spend eternity in hell because I didn't say something. That is a ton of pressure. All right. Well, at any rate, I know the speech went well. Any feedback do you remember at all, or was it all pretty celebratory?
My youth pastor was very proud, which meant a lot to me. I don't remember my family saying much. At that point, I feel like I was more religious than my family. Now that's obviously reversed. I don't remember friends really saying much. I remember it maybe being like a little awkward. And then that night we had like our senior party or whatever.
I remember that.
I remember just having fun and, having some good conversations with people, but not really talking about this.
We were on to other things at that point, but
we were.
Hey, you did your job.
Yes, the message has been received. Now it's up to you, heathens, to accept it or not. Right.
What happened from there? Let's hear some of the mile markers of going to the Bible college, and then really just go ahead and fill in those pieces.
Yeah, sure. So I had thought a lot about what I wanted to do after high school, but eventually settled on preparing for the ministry. So I went to downtown Chicago to Moody Bible Institute. That's where my youth pastor had gone. So kind of spoke well of it.
Yeah.
I got a Bachelor's of Arts in Pastoral Studies. I also met my daughter's mother, my first wife there, and we got married after I finished my junior year. I hadn't finished school yet. And then after that, I found a position as an associate pastor in Wisconsin in a small town just north of Milwaukee. And I was an associate pastor. It was a non-denominational church, and I was an associate pastor there for 3.5, almost 4 years before I left.
What is one thing you wish congregants or anybody would understand about the life of a pastor or an associate pastor?
I think just how challenging it is, that it's really a 24/7 job and you can't just kind of phone it in. You have to be fully dedicated, and it takes everything from you. You know, it takes a lot of passion and commitment and heart and sincerity. And in that sense, it's a very demanding job. And it's, of course, very demanding on one's family as well. So I think sometimes that's not necessarily understood. It's like, oh, do you just work one day a week on Sunday?
Right. Or that yeah, there's no preparation, right?
Right.
Or no 9 p.m. calls, or later even, right? Because when a lot of times when they reach out to you, they're in crisis.
Right. Yeah. So there's definitely like hospital visits late at night, or crisis issues. And then, you're also, in addition to the more obvious ministerial tasks, you're basically managing a small organization or a small business, as you will. So there's board meetings and paperwork and finances and all those kinds of things that would come with any small business or small organization.
Well, what'd you think? Did you enjoy it? Were there parts that you enjoyed? And then what gradually made you say after 3.5 years, I don't know if this is it?
Yeah, so there was a lot that I did enjoy. I enjoyed teaching, and I got to do a lot of that. In fact, I started, they didn't have a Sunday school program for adults when I came there. So I basically started that, and I taught a lot of the classes, and I taught the high school Sunday school class for a while. So I really like that. I like being part of a community, and they were a really good community and supportive. I remember when our car broke down, one of the elders just lent us a car for a week until we could buy something else. And so I've hardly ever felt as well connected to a community, as when we were there. Some of the things that led me to leave were basically 4 reasons that I'll run through quickly. One was that I missed school, and so I started taking master's level classes in theology from a distance program while I was still pastoring, but I wanted to go and engage in that program full time and in person. The second thing was my wife at the time. It was very demanding on her. I was the associate pastor. She was essentially expected to be the associate pastor, but she wasn't given a title or a salary or really a whole lot of respect because she was a woman, and this was a church and a denomination that didn't ordain women. So she couldn't have any official title, but she basically needed to do the job.
And smile, right?
Right. Yep. And be available all the time and be a good example and live in the fishbowl, where everybody's watching who and how you are, So that really wore on her. And she was, I think, getting ready for a change as well. I guess the third thing was I started to see some of the hypocrisy of the church and ways that instead of helping problems, at times they were just trying to smooth things over and make sure the church looked good. And there were a few instances of that kind of thing. And then the fourth layer was I was continuing to have my intellectual doubts. And that was some of why I was interested in continuing my graduate studies. In fact, the very first class that I took from seminary when I was still taking it at a distance was The Problems of Evil and Suffering. And that was an upper level elective, not usually the class you would start with.
But you were like, this is on my mind right now.
Yeah, exactly. That was the pressing question. And so when I saw that was one of the classes they offered, that was the very first one I jumped in on.
Wow. Yeah. What'd you learn on that class?
It was great. It was very involved, very philosophical. There's kind of a personal side to the problem of suffering. Is usually the problem of suffering is that personal existential experience, but the problem of evil is actually a logical problem, and it gets framed in different ways. But the idea that if God is all knowing and God is all good and God is all powerful, then there should be no evil. But there is evil. So somehow you have to take away one of the elements of that equation. And that's the problem of evil, is how do you solve that equation? How do you put all of those elements together? So you have to kind of explain away evil in some ways, or modify your conception of God to make that work. And it's a very perplexing
That's
problem,
a bugaboo, man. That's that's hard to solve. Bit. I mean, that's you're trying to keep this card. What do they say? The when you stack cards up, it's like you're trying to keep it balanced. You're trying to not let any of them fall,
right?
And yet you take one card out, or even look at one card, the whole thing can fall. So right. It's never, at least it wasn't for me. It wasn't a single moment, but more of a couple of questions that just kept gnawing at me. Things not making sense. Was that the primary one for you then?
Yeah, probably the problem of evil. I always had questions about the arguments for the existence of God, like how do we prove that there is a God, that kind of thing. So I feel like I went to seminary and did a master's in philosophical theology, partly because I wanted to teach. And that's what I started to envision myself more as a theology professor than as a pastor. Mm-hmm. And I thought that would fit better. But mostly it was all part of my own intellectual quest. Like, I was curious about these things, so I pursued them. I think it was more like a slow dawning than like one moment that I realized I didn't believe. But these were the primary questions that pushed at me.
So, Matt, would you say, too, moving around like you did, being around other people, I mean, that was a part of it when you say getting out of the bubble?
Yeah, for sure. Like, looking back at my undergraduate, I'm like, I can't believe I went to Moody as like not even just a conservative Christian, but a fundamentalist Christian school. And I'm like, what was I doing there? But one of the great gifts about Moody is right in downtown Chicago. And every year they assign you a ministry in a different part of the city. So I spent a year working on the south side of Chicago in one of the worst neighborhoods with kids. I spent a year on the west side. I spent a year on the south side of Evanston. So for this like suburban West Michigan kid, it broadened my world and it blew it open really to see racism and structural poverty and generational issues and infrastructure issues and all that. And it really began to make me think maybe all that's wrong with the world isn't just a lack of personal belief in Jesus, but some actually really tangible material things like poverty and violence and injustice and those kinds of things.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And did you meet people of different faiths as well?
Yeah, that was definitely part of it, in Chicago being such a diverse place. And then again, I did my master's degree in the Twin Cities, and that's very diverse. I remember my mom coming to visit, and there's a lot of East African, Somali people that live in Minneapolis. And, the women, many of them are Muslim. So many of the women will wear a hijab, and my mom was scared, and she kind of grabbed my arm in the grocery store, and I'm like, what? She's just buying a cantaloupe, Mom. And she's like, I've never seen that before, And then I also developed a personal interest, and so I started in Buddhism specifically. So I started doing a lot of reading and research about Buddhism to the point that when I started my PhD, I was pretty knowledgeable in that. One of the things that I did after I left my academic and ministerial career is I ended up teaching world religions in a community college in Chicago, and I did that for 5 years.
Wow. I didn't know that.
Oh, really? Okay. Yeah. So I was a adjunct professor at a community college, and I would teach world religions and philosophy of religion. I taught intro to philosophy once. So it felt good because I had an opportunity to use a lot of what I studied.
Yeah, I knew you taught, but I didn't realize it was religions,
Right.
So that's very interesting, especially with what we've been talking about.
Yeah, for sure. And so, and the department chair who hired me, she said, the stuff you studied in your undergraduate was less interesting, but it got more interesting as things went on because I had more progressive and like liberatory studies, but also I had put my research interest in Buddhism there, and that kind of caught her eye.
I see.
But and also for world religions, they wanted you to also teach on an indigenous religion. So I ended up, and I didn't know much about this at the time. I knew a little bit, but I ended up teaching a unit on African indigenous religions. And I really found that intriguing and took a deep dive into that and did all kinds of creative things to teach that to people. So I felt like I actually developed a reasonable secondary knowledge about that.
Well, and I would imagine too, when you're seeing all these different slices of doing things and believing, you start to see parallels, you start to see patterns, the details might be different, but as far as how people answer those big questions, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, you both see the diversity, that there's different ways to live and believe and people function. And who's to say, like, 17-year-old me standing at the podium at DeVos Hall has all those answers when there's all these other traditions and ideas and that kind of thing. But you're also right that there are some common structures and features, at least in the way that religion functions in an individual and in communities and those kinds of things. So to kind of fast forward, like while I did that master's degree, I worked at a drug rehab clinic, which was quite a great experience. And then we moved back to Chicago and I started a PhD in systematic theology. And at some point during that, I was kind of a couple things came together. I was continuing to have my struggles and my doubts and my intellectual questions. And then my wife at the time and I were going through a divorce. And so I took a leave of absence. And I remember talking to my doctoral advisor, who is this brilliant professor from Argentina. She did like liberationist theology, like Marxist theology. By that point, I was deep into like very progressive, liberatory kind of theologies, trying to find my place within all of this, you know? And then she looked at me one day and she's like, I'm such an enthusiast, but you don't really believe any of this, do you?
What a way to phrase it.
Yeah. And I was like, and at the time, like I was a doctoral student and she was traveling a lot. So I was essentially teaching some of her classes while she was away. So I remember I was doing a lot of teaching in a class on pneumatology, which is the doctrine of the Holy Spirit. And so I looked at her after she asked me that.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I'm like, I find all of this really interesting, but no, you're right. I don't believe it. And that, I think, if there was it's kind of like the dawn, it's getting brighter and brighter. And then all of a sudden, at some point, you realize, like, the sun is up,
Yeah. So, but now you're faced with the reality of, okay, I go home. Different reality here of, what do I do now?
Right.
If I'm not believing this, am I supposed to be teaching this? And now what do I do? That really brings in the Clergy project a bit, doesn't it? So let's talk. Yeah. Some of our listeners, I don't know if they're in the spot you were, but certainly they know people who could be. And so let's just, from a basic definition, what's the Clergy project about?
Yeah, so it's an organization that exists to help members of the clergy and clergy of all religions, not just Christianity, but Islam, Judaism, Buddhism, whatever the case may be, and to help people that are clergy or have been clergy, but now find themselves to be humanist or atheist or whatever they term themselves, but not believers anymore. And they assist. First of all, they just provide a community, but they also provide some practical help like job assistance and advice and some counseling resources and all those kinds of things to help people navigate that transition. Because, that's the challenge is say you're a Jewish rabbi or a Christian minister, pastor. This is your job. This is how you make a living, as well as like how you've identified yourself, what you've spent years and tens of thousands of dollars on an education to get. It's what your family and friends know you as. So if you begin to understand yourself as having gone through an intellectual and belief change, that's a whole lot that all of a sudden no longer fits, and you need to navigate that. And so some people are trying to navigate those conversations with their family or with their spouse. Some people are going through a divorce because now that they don't believe, their spouse does not want to stay married to them. Unequally yoked is like the Bible phrase.
Exactly, right.
Yeah.
But you're really highlighting the multiple steps. It's not just, I'll just choose a different job. No, this is bigger than that.
Right,
much bigger than that. Financial issues. If I went all out into this degree, that means I missed out on, I guess, use the economics term, right? Opportunity cost. I've given up other training I could have been doing.
Yeah.
And so if I become a one-trick pony, now what do I do?
Yeah, exactly. Like I had done an undergraduate degree, a master's degree, and I was about halfway through my PhD at this point. So that's
a long time to say, all right, I'm out.
Yeah, exactly. So
that's the Clergy project. And they provide that safety, right?
Right, and they provide that kind of assistance. Now, for me, I actually didn't come across the Clergy Project until much later. And how that came about was I was in therapy at the time and just working through issues from my life with a very good therapist. And definitely recommend therapy for those that are able to have that opportunity. And one of the many threads we talked about was this role in religion in my life. And I often have felt this bifurcation because people that knew me when I was young, like heard my graduation speech,
Exactly.
have a hard time understanding who I am now because I'm not that guy anymore. And people that meet me now, this atheist trucker or whatever, have no idea who I was before. So it's like this split in my life, you know?
Yeah. Certainly, even though it was years later that you found out, I'm sure you immediately recognized, holy cow, that would have been great if I had a group like that.
Yeah, exactly. Right. And how it came about was talking through these issues with my therapist. She's like, is there a group out there that for people that used to be clergy but now are atheists? Because they could relate to you in a way nobody else could. And I'm like, that's a good question. So I researched, and that's how I found the Clergy Project, and then connected with them and had some really helpful conversations and discussions and things like that. So for me, by that point, because when I was in doctoral school, I started working part-time at the library. And then as I stepped away from belief and my academic career in theology and all that stuff, the library became my full-time job and evolved. So I didn't necessarily have the vocational needs that some other people have run into. My marriage was ending otherwise for other reasons.
Sure.
So I wasn't dealing with that on that level. So I didn't have as many needs at the point in life where I found the Clergy Project, but they were still really helpful to me just in terms of identity and processing trauma and processing past thoughts and identity issues, all that kind of stuff.
Reframing all that has happened.
Right, exactly. Yeah. So I see how they're immensely helpful for people that have all those needs, but also some eminently practical needs, like I need a job and my marriage is in trouble,
Yes. I have two really just very brief questions. What's one thing you wish others would understand about atheists, or however you define yourself today?
Yeah. I guess one thing, maybe a broader thing that I would hope people would understand is that it's a journey, and that's okay. When I look back on my life, sometimes I'm like, where was I? What did I believe? And all that. But a common thread for me has always been this pursuit of truth. Mm-hmm. And that's has always held true from when I was that sixth grader hearing the gospel message for the first time till right now here today, as I've been interested in what is true and living my life according to truth. And that's taken me on a lot of different places. And I think people should be open to that. That truth might take you different places. You don't just have to get it figured out at one age and then stick to that. So I guess, one thing, I guess I would probably define myself more as a humanist than an atheist. I don't mind the atheist title, but it more defines yourself by what you're not than by what you are. And I find a lot of hope and optimism in humanism, in a non-religious kind of viewpoint on life. So I guess what many people don't understand is, one, we're just all on a journey, and this is where our journey is right here and right now. And that, two, atheists or humanists are not immoral people out there sinning and doing evil. In fact, one could maybe make the argument that, and studies show that atheists live every bit as morally as other people. One could even make the argument that atheists are doing what they do simply because they believe it's the right thing to do, rather than because they fear some sort of eternal punishment. So in terms of philosophical ethics, it's more because of virtue ethics, like the inherent rightness of it, rather than some sort of intrinsic fear motivator. Yeah,
I appreciate you both bringing the idea of humanism, secular humanism, I suppose, in terms of the outwardness, but also truth. And I guess that's one thing that still bugs me a little bit. I've been asked before, or I've been told, gosh, for being an atheist, you sure talk about God a lot. Have you ever heard that?
A little bit, although, but, I'm a good number of years out, so I probably don't talk about God that much.
But when I rephrase it as, I am interested in truth, that feels different.
Right.
And that's sometimes what bugs me a little bit. I just sometimes feel like people are on autopilot at church sometimes. maybe that's how both you and I kind of have that drive of, truth. I'm going to rephrase it as truth.
Yeah. One thing my PhD advisor said, which I really respected, is that people need to have an epistemic rupture. And epistemology, as you know, being, this the part of philosophy dealing with knowledge, truth, belief, and justification of those beliefs. And so it's this idea that even if there's small steps along the way, usually there is this moment of rupture, and that's because there's a certain amount of inertia to your epistemology or to what you believe. Like, it just doesn't change every day. And that's a good thing, because every day you'd wake up believing something different and you'd be totally scattered. So we tend to sort of preserve what we believe, and it requires less energy and less effort and less uncertainty to do that. But that means that some people kind of get stuck there instead of being open and not feeling threatened if their epistemology changes or if they consider a change to their way of believing and knowing and looking at the world. And so, I think, like you said, a lot of people are on autopilot because they're just not willing to look at those issues and question fundamental things.
Well, what would it cost?
Right. It might cost them a lot, and for me, I find that exciting. Like, if somebody can show me that I'm wrong and why, I find that exciting. But many people are frightened by that.
And so now this is taking you places, other job roles. So just very briefly, what are the other job roles, career moves you've made?
Yeah.
Bring us to today.
Right. So I mentioned I was kind of I was a part-time security guard at the library when I was doing my doctoral program. And then that evolved into a couple different positions. I eventually became a full librarian at the library, went back and did another master's degree in library science. And then at the same time, I was teaching at the community college. So I had both of those things going on. And then, just a few years ago, my daughter was going off to college. I was just ready for a big change. We had just kind of gotten through the worst of the pandemic. So I left all that and I became a truck driver, and I've been doing that for getting close to 3 years now. And I love that.
But what is a couple things that you love about it?
Well, I love the gift of time.
Yeah.
Occasionally, I'm busy with unloading or loading or something, but I still have hours and hours every day to listen to music. I listen to a lot of books. I get through way more books now than I did as a librarian. I listen to a lot of podcasts too. And so I love having the time. I love the scenery and the travel, and I end up different places every weekend, and I always find some sort of adventure to get up to. And then I guess the last thing is I love just experiencing, I was in the church, I was in academia, I was in libraries. So a lot of like liberal leaning social service kind of organizations. Now I'm in a totally different sector of the economy. I might be unloading fertilizer to some farmer in Oklahoma and chatting with him about his farm, while we unload stuff. So I meet all kinds of different people and learn a lot about how the economy works, a different slice of it than what I ever saw before.
And then you preach the good word. I'm just kidding.
Whatever the good word of the day is.
Exactly. Yes. The good word of the day. There we go.
That's right.
Well, is there anything else you want to leave our listeners with or want them to know? And particularly, let's put it this way, any listeners who are feeling that dissonance between what they do and what they believe, or maybe even the need just for some type of change, such as a career change?
Yeah, I guess I would say don't be afraid of the quest. Don't be afraid of the questions, the journey. Truth is your friend. It might feel unsettling, but it will lead you to some exciting places if you're willing to question things. And there's other people on that journey as well that you will discover, and it will open up new horizons of the world. And if you're afraid to question or think about what you believe and why you believe it, it's worth thinking, why are you afraid to question that? Because to me, if something is true, it can hold up to the most vigorous of inquiry. And if your beliefs can't, then you have to think maybe what you believe is not actually true.
I love it. That's a great final word. Thank you so much, Matt. I appreciate you.
Yeah, of course. Thanks for having me on, Scott. Appreciate it.
Peace out.
All right.
No church bells in the distance, no temples to confide, just miles of open highway, nowhere that I hide.
Thanks for listening. Our intro music was created by an anonymous supporter of the show. Any other music or sound effects, they were provided by this week's co-host, Artie Fisher.
Do you have a question or a comment? Would you like to be on our show? Contact us through the show notes. You can also find Skeptical Scott on Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok.
Drop the supernatural, embrace the rational, and believe in as many true things as possible.
Otherwise, you may end up believing in something that is even more artificial than me.
May skeptical thoughts be with you.
And also with you.
See you next Friday. Cheers.
Living free and thinking as the open highways thunder. Dinosaurs in truck stops, fossils from ancient lands, stories told by nature, under earth and sands. I don't need a preacher to take me by the hands. The truths in evolution, in seas and desert bands. Listening to the radio voices from